Thank you so much, Diego, for this invitation. And because my presentation is at 20 minutes, I will start immediately. I do want to apologize. There might be a little bit of noise in the background because they decided to remove some trees on my street today. So I apologize for that. It's a little distracting. Every Labor Day weekend for over a decade, Father or Abuna Daoud Lamai, a popular priest from Cairo with a major following in the Coptic diaspora, holds a retreat on family, social issues, and evangelism in the New York City area. Before a lecture during the retreat of 2017, Abuna answered questions from the audience brought to him on white pieces of paper. One question asked how youth in America should approach issues such as same-sex marriage and homosexuality. Abuna responded, "In my opinion, you have more persecution here as Christians than we do in Egypt. Here you have a secular society that imposes demands on you as Christians that are against your faith. In Egypt, we may have a terrorist come and blow up a church, but it doesn't affect our faith. You all are more of a minority here than we are there." In my brief comments today, I consider how focus on the threat of political secularism, as construed by Abuna Daoud, displaces analysis from the more pervasive force of the secular on a Coptic Orthodox discursive tradition. Along this line of inquiry, I am particularly interested in the attempt to construct categories of the secular and the religious in terms of which modern living is required to take place. And this includes proper knowledge of religious tradition and the acts of purification required to uncover what is truly religious. Thinking with Charles Hirschkin's inquiry into the idea of a secular body, this talk engages the ethnographic context of religious education and reform among transnational Copts to ponder practices of secular self-fashioning and gestures to how these more analytically evasive social sensibilities and dispositions produce particular political predicaments. A consequence of focusing on the mystical and otherworldly aspects of our respective field sites, churches, shrines, monasteries, and the like, is that there has been little room for a conversation among anthropologists of religion and Christianity in particular on the ways in which the secular, thought of here as a constellation of institutions, ideas, and effective orientations, shapes the religious sensibilities of our interlocutors. In his seminal article, Charles Hirschkin describes how a secular person is someone whose effective gestural repertoires express a negative relation to a form of embodiment historically associated with theistic religion. Given this definition of the secular person, how does one consider the religious person who also seeks to consciously cultivate, mold, and shape an anti-secular self? When I first began my research in the New York, New Jersey area in 2016, I spoke with second-generation American Copts educated in theology and concerned for the future of the church in the United States. As Copts increasingly immigrated to the US following the 2011 revolution and the 2013 coup in Egypt, many second-generation and earlier first-generation Copts grew concerned over the shift in communal focus to social services for new migrants. Coming from different socioeconomic classes and more rural regions of Egypt, these new migrants pose problems for earlier generations of Copts who have mainly been concerned with cultural assimilation and more recently, apologetics. During an interview with two theologians in Staten Island, New York in the summer of 2016, I noticed copies of James K.A. Smith's How Not to Be Secular, a Religious Person's Guide to Reading Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, marked up on their desks. I inquired into the text, and they both enthusiastically recommended it, since it, quote, helped them think about ministry in the diaspora. In the preface, Smith juxtaposes believers and skeptics within the realm of witnessing and ministry, yet also wonders whether believers are even outside of the realm of the secular. He writes, "So what does it look like to bear witness in a secular age? What does it look like to be faithful? To what extent have Christians unwittingly absorbed the tendencies of this world? On one hand, this raises the question of how to reach exclusive humanists. On the other hand, the question bounces back on the church. To what extent do we believe like exclusive humanists, end quote. While Smith concedes that the secular touches everything, he suggests that there are possible ways to cultivate resistance. Yet such practices of resistance also fit into the game of secularism, insofar as they participate in a movement of negation and an overcoming by which the religious prevails over the secular. For our purposes here today, what are these transnational Coptic practices of negation? In May 2017, masked gunmen opened fire on a bus of Coptic pilgrims to the monastery of St. Samuel the Confessor in Minya, Upper Egypt, killing at least 28 people and injuring 22 others. The Sunday after the attack, I attended liturgy in the village of Bajura, Upper Egypt, and the priest leading the service framed the massacre as a joyous event, one that adds to the long tradition of the Coptic Church as a church flooded with the blood of martyrs. At the end of the sermon, the priest looked to the sullen crowd and reminded us, saying, quote, "We live in a secular world, alam almeni, and our faith must continuously overcome the tendencies towards secularism and disbelief. If we don't have faith, we don't have anything," end quote. Later that summer, I was driving in Staten Island, New York with a second-generation deacon who spoke with me on the importance of Coptic hymns to his life, saying, "For many of us who are in hymnology, it takes over your life. I don't really listen to any secular music. It's not that I think it's haram, but I just don't get anything out of it. Yeah, I'll listen to it when I'm mad at God. I'll make a point out of it. Our dad taught us to be spiritually minded, and that has guided my brother and I, even in our interest in hymns." These attitudes function on a distinct mode of secular power mobilized by a process of differentiation. While Charles Hirschkin notes that such practices of secular self-fashioning are contained within the continued overcoming of those forms of knowledge and practice understood to be religious, I would also argue that secular self-fashioning can be understood through the shaping of material culture, pedagogies, and politics also perceived as not properly religious, and in the case of Coptic Orthodox, not properly traditional. Put another way, while a secular person is usually understood as disembodied, I wonder, can the idea of a secular body through processes of religious secular differentiation also impact upon religious bodies in the manner of distinction between educated, knowledgeable aesthetics from that which is lived, done, and made, or as my interlocutors demarcated, between faith and culture? During a hot summer day in 2016, I sat with Adam, a 23-year-old consecrated servant, second generation, and educated at a preeminent Eastern Orthodox seminary. While stroking his beard, he conveyed his unease about the intermingling of Orthodox tradition with Coptic cultural heritage, saying, quote, "I think in Egypt you are born Coptic Orthodox, so you live Coptic Orthodox. You bleed Coptic Orthodox until you die Coptic Orthodox. That's your identity. It's very much a part of who you are because the culture is very religious based. And your name even defines who you are. You're either a Mina or an Ahmed. But here in the US, that's definitely not the case. If you're a Coptic Orthodox Christian born and raised here, you have to make the decision to be an Orthodox Christian. You have to have faith. You have to actively believe in God, actively believe in the sacraments, and believe they are transformative. You have to be kingdom driven. Here you have the people who actually want to live an Orthodox sacramental life, and you have this giant group of people who are just like, this is who we are. The goals of both sides are different. The goal of one side is heaven bound, and the goal of the other side is not to say they aren't heaven bound, but it's less of a faith experience and more of an ethos," end quote. In this reading, the passive quality of Copticity in Egypt lends itself to a less sincere faith experience than those Coptic Orthodox in the US. Faith necessitates a conscious, sincere testimony and a localizable experience. Ethos is an embodiment that does not necessarily rise to everyday consciousness. In this differentiation, Coptic religious subjectivity within American society presupposes sovereignty of a secular self that is demonstrated through knowing one's faith. This division between abstracted knowledge and embodied ethos is one of the ways in which secular power is operationalized. Among Coptic seminarians at Eastern Orthodox institutions and Coptic clergy, liturgical vestments have also been a site of differentiation. One clergy interlocutor in New York City noted to me, quote, "Our vestments are what they are because we're overrun by the Arabs for 1,200 years of Egyptian history. Now you have these seminarians at St. Vladimir's and elsewhere wanting to Byzantinize things," end quote. Bola, a seminarian in his early 20s, had grown frustrated with this lax perspective towards Coptic accountability. "Anything goes in terms of vestments in the Coptic Orthodox Church," he told me, dressed in his black galabeya with his laptop open to Facebook photos of priests from Australia, donned in what he deemed to be proper vestments. This slide and the next are such examples of proper vestments. There's not really standardization in our church. There are random unspoken rules, like if the bishop is present, the priest doesn't wear his sadra or stole. If you've noticed in the past 20 years, tonias or deacons' vestments have saints' pictures on them. That didn't start with the Holy Synod decreeing that it would be nice to have blah, blah, blah. Rather, this tont, a female elder, in this random mejrel or vestment shop, in this random village, figured out how to make this saint's picture embroidered on a tonia. It's an example. My fellow panelist and anthropologist of Orthodox Christianity, Timothy Carroll, has discussed the ability of fabric to shape sacred space and examined the social life of sacred fabrics such as vestments. Bridging from Carroll, I also wonder about the political lives and imperial afterlives of fabric. In the practices of differentiation between the mundane and the sacred, even within liturgical practice itself, Bola continued, "It bothers me because I've been in so many Orthodox circles and I can see what's normal. And then I have to introduce this idea into the Coptic Church because it lost it due to a lack of education. It's frustrating because some random tont in some random village can make something up out of nowhere. And then there are people like myself who are educated and can say this is actually what you're supposed to do. Something kind of coming out of actual education gets attacked, whereas something that comes out of total ignorance and total sloppiness is revered," end quote. Well, the tension Bola sets up can also be read as a sociological stratification of religion into popular and elite practices. I'd argue that this conflict pertains to particular modes of purification. When reform is proposed, there is an assumption that the tradition's essence, what is perceived to be essential to it, is not to be changed, but defended through purification, the process of separating what is contingent from what is essential. This process of critical purification or modernization is a process of what must be transgressed if tradition is to become civilized. Under British colonial regimes in 19th and 20th century Egypt, competition with Protestant and Catholic missionary pedagogies moved lay elites within the Coptic Church to build a religious education program comparable with Western modes of scholastic education. As Bishop Ambasoriel describes in his seminal work on Coptic reformer Habib Girgis, Anglican missionaries provided textbooks with the sole goal of transforming education and tradition and eliminating a culture in which, quote, "the speakers of words rather than the writers of texts were the bearers of authority." The colonial destruction of world culture and its authority among Copts and the rise of textual supremacy was an important step in efforts to control native Egyptians' morality and behavior. The struggle to reconcile the changes in techniques and criteria that came along with the colonial establishment of modern education in Egypt with the purification of a Coptic tradition continues to manifest in transnational contexts like the US. In another conversation with Bola and others educated at Eastern Orthodox seminaries, improper vestment wearing was again central to their concerns. In the basement of a church in Staten Island, after the weekly meeting with the bishop, George, an interlocutor in his early 20s, expressed with glee that Abuna Bishoy had celebrated liturgy earlier that day, fully vested. Another priest there pulled out his cell phone with excitement to show me a selfie of him in his handcrafted botte rochelle or stole, costing him over $200. I think if I was trying to wear my Sunday best, I would buy a $200 suit, he reasoned. The conversation on vestments that evening, as we waited for the bishop to enter, revolved around the lack of care in the Coptic Church for education on proper community fashioning. Concern over vestments is grounded in a particular kind of rationalism, whereby the randomness of style points to a deficiency of knowledge and organization. More than a concern over religious authority, this rationalism is preoccupied with the lack of textual grounding, in that there is no written rite of vestments in the Coptic Church today. Bola again noted the following in our interview together. Growing up, the priest would just wear his tonya and his hat, and if he was really feeling it, his cape. And it didn't bother me because that just was what it was. But then I got educated and understood that it was not the common practice in any church. It became so clear when I went to an Eastern Orthodox school. Now I'm in our churches and I see our priests praying in nothing, and I feel disrespected. We are treating it like this thing that we're just doing. Rational authentication and narratives of proper teaching refer to adherence to organization, education, and piety. Accusations of inaccuracy to the Orthodox tradition, whether that be a lack of vestment rite or fidelity to a textualized hymnology, gesture to a kind of religious ignorance and incomplete morality. Achieving modernity or rightness as rationality, then, is about the acquisition of a particular textual knowledge and historical truth, and the discernment of the improperly religious. These processes of differentiation are also oriented through land and spatial relations of representation and movement. In late fall 2017, I exited the sweltering Cairo metro at the Azbet al-Nakhal station. A priest had just returned from St. Anthony's Monastery near the Red Sea, where, after losing his wife and daughter, he now lives as a monk. In Azbet al-Nakhal, Abuna rents a room along with other visiting monks and priests in a neighborhood building. Adorning the walls of his dorm room are hundreds of books on theology and Coptic history. Stacks of books even cover the floor. I asked Abuna about the importance of theological education and how it relates to the preservation of the Coptic tradition. You know, the West took the tradition, our heritage, turos, of our fathers, translated them and studied their works. So when you talk about academic methodology in the West, they benefited more from our fathers than we did. But we excelled in something else. What they have is an academic tradition, el turos al-almi. We have a practical tradition, el turos al-nuski or saluki. What does that mean? The first is a doctor of medicine. You give him a book on wounds and injuries, he reads it, but he is still unable to perform a surgery to fix these injuries. The second has never been to medical school, but he's able to perform surgeries without these books. And I'll conclude here. Embodied knowledge, or ethos, if you will, lies in the understanding that the senses are meaning-generating apparatuses that operate beyond consciousness and intention. Ethos is constructed out of the cross-communication of senses and Coptic material worlds, in the soil soaked with the blood of martyrs, the air, the fleshy body, the sound of hymns, the smell of incense. Ethos is bodily, yet it exceeds the limits of the secular body. Tradition, or truly life, is not always lived as critique, yet secular self-fashioning introduces the constant self-critique as progressivist improvement. A Coptic interlocutor in New Jersey suggested the following on this point. The colonial argument goes that we were just poor individuals going through the liturgy and the priest purchased their position, or it was about family, kind of a miserable framing. But that just didn't make sense to me. What did make sense to me was that there is something liturgical in our educational system. It isn't about the content, but what you are doing as a people. In diaspora, the Coptic stakes of education are interpreted through contexts of secular threat qua political secularism that places emphasis on knowing and evidencing the faith. Yet today, I have aimed to trace the underbelly of these more spectacular engagements by looking to its shadows in the techniques of secular self-fashioning within the intellectualization of Coptic Orthodoxy. These transnational trends call for significant attention to the ways in which Orthodox morphologies of homeland change with respect to Copts outside of Egypt, and to how secular power distinguishes proper religious tradition among them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Candace. That was a wonderful presentation. And it also, this needs to self-consciously rediscover orthodoxy and redefine the boundary between correct practice and insincere ritualism, or a heterodox practice, is something that really resonates with some of my findings on the Ethiopian Orthodox diaspora. So it's very familiar, but the articulation you presented is absolutely fascinating. Our next speaker is Timothy Carroll. Timothy, we'll give you a minute to set up your
Thank you.
Presentation, please.
Let's see if I can find the right path forward. I really loved your talk, Candace, and I find it a very appropriate collaboration with mine. So we'll see, we take it in a slightly different direction, but we end up actually picking up from where you left off in a way, and moving into more the theological side of some of the same issues. So I also changed the title slightly of what I was anticipating as I got into the issues. And are the captions on? There we go. So apophatic cups, shared spoons, and dual discourses of contagion. In Orthodoxy, everything is a symbol. Vestments, i.e. clothing, are a symbol, not only those of priests, but everybody. And here the bishops that I'm speaking with, Boulos of Aleppo, points to the monks and pilgrims around us. The simple use natural language with the civilized symbols, poetry. You can say, I love you, this is natural, but it means more to say it in poetry. The symbols are apophatic. God is love, yes, but he is more than that. The same symbols that we know as a child, we still need to know when we grow. We continue to show us new things. The problem with the Orthodox today is not having symbols, but understanding them. The means are there, but they must be known. What I would like to do today is a short thought experiment to address a problem that I have faced for some time. The problem presents itself to me in the words of Sayyidina Boulos of Aleppo, as we sat on a bench out front the trapeza, or the dining hall, in the monastery of Vatopedi on Mount Athos in Greece, waiting to be called in for the morning meal. He had asked me why I was there at Vatopedi. At the time, I was a doctoral student studying the uses of textiles in the Eastern Orthodox Church. I was at Vatopedi for a month with particular interest in the Agia Zoni, or the Holy Belt of the Mother of God. He was excited by this research and instructed me with the importance of learning the symbols of the church and teaching them to the people. In doing so, he introduced me to the idea of apophatic symbols. I will eventually get to the topic of contagion, both holy and viral. However, first I have to backpedal from the immediate topic of how blessings and viruses move within liturgical space in order to ask a more fundamental question: what are the symbols of the church and how do they work? In other words, in order to get at a fair analysis of what is at stake when Orthodox Christians use a shared spoon, a common cup, or refrain from kissing an icon upon entering a temple, we must first consider the dual function of the Orthodox symbol as both disclosure and concealment. At its core, the concept of apophatic theology is defined as a theological knowledge via negation, as opposed to cataphatic theology. that is, through positive affirmation. However, in the Greek Orthodox context, apophaticism as a method is more complex than a simple negation, the truth of which apophaticism points to, as John Zuzoulis explains, lies beyond the choice between affirmation and negation. Christos Yanaras explains, the apophaticism of the Greek East is not confined to negations. It proposes both affirmative knowledge, natural knowledge, and at the same time, its denial, that is to say, the abandonment of any claim to consolidate and objectify the truth in conceptual definitions. That is to say, that apophaticism is a method that resists the kind of linguistic purification that took root in Western scholasticism and is exemplified in Christian moderns, such as the work of Webb Keen. Rather, this work to purify the conceptual of theological articulations, apophaticism is a dynamic starting point for the realization of an empirical relationship with a designated reality. This concept of empirical relationship he defines as the specific capacity of the human subject to approach the knowledge of reality by means of a general faculty of apprehension, that is to say, a coordination of several factors in the event of knowing, such as sensation, understanding, judgment, imagination, abstraction, reduction, emotion, intuition, insight, etc. In the semantics of apophatic thesis and antithesis, in the naming and the unnaming, an image is produced. The apophatic is not only a single thesis, but in fact the thesis, its antithesis, their abandonment, and the image left behind has iconic likeness, even though in its essence, it is entirely unlike the truth of which we are in pursuit. The affirmation and negation done in the same stroke of the pen, such as being beyond being, divinity beyond divinity, source beyond source, to quote John of Damascus, produces a most sweet conjunction, one that transforms the conceptual opposition into a depiction in image. In the work of Dionysius the Areopagite and those following him, image is used in its most broad sense, as not only material icon, but also the object of thought called to mind through words, or more important for Dionysius, the movements of the liturgy and invites the human into relation. This dynamic image of vision, it's telling me my internet is unstable, I'll pause. This dynamic image of vision of formless and shapeless truth is made accessible to human cognition through the forms and shapes, which are an invitation in the dynamic ascent, that's a quotation, towards a not only intellectual, but fully phenomenological knowing of truth. At the same time, however, it is also an unutterable enigma hiding the truth, making it inaccessible to those who approach it simply through instrumental knowledge. The image, which results from the dance of thesis and antithesis, is only sensible as both perceivable and intelligible if the person accepts the invitation to assent. The image is fundamentally an invitation that relies on the bodily senses to transcend the bodily senses and bring the whole person into participation with God. It is via the dynamic response, a synergistic coaction of person and divine energy, that is cognitive passage, and by which this is possible. This point is worth clarifying, for the cognitive passage here is not solely one of rational assent, but rather another kind of knowledge. It is an experiential cognitive human capacity, one which is realized dynamically on all three levels of human cognition, as is understood by the ancients in terms of sensation, reason, and the heart, or nous. In fact, the image invites the human into a personal relationship with the signified. This empirical relationship is, finally, one of erotic love. There's a hesitancy expressed in the literature, both ancient and modern, about this term, but the passion of the personal relationship is a starting point for apophatic knowledge. This love is one of passion in the literal sense, something being suffered, It is a full of yearning, self-offering, and free of any objective. At its core, apophatic theology is an invitation to this, quote, experience of God as a mad lover of the whole creation of each human person. So, what is the point? In Eastern Orthodoxy, the senses serve as an entry point for communion with the divine, while rational assent to propositional knowledge has its own place in Orthodoxy. The wealth of symbolism throughout the church, to which, as Sayyid Nabullos said, the person must return time and time again, these are the means to not only know about God, but actually know God in the empirical, personal, passionate manner of a mad lover. In a longer form of this paper, I spent some time considering ideas of contagion as they appear in the wider anthropological literature on Christianity. This work tends to focus on the distinctions that can be drawn between types of people as a result of how substances such as grace, blessing, or pollution flow between people. However, my interest here is primarily concerned with how the concepts of blessing and disease move between objects and persons. As such, for our purposes now, I will only touch briefly on contagion as it is drawn out in the art historical literature, specifically around the idea of object agency. In her analysis of relics in the first millennium of the Christian Church, Cynthia Han discusses the contagious nature of the virtus of a saint, the virtue. But she suggests translating virtue more as the power of the holy person. Han argues that while the relics of the saints are gathered since at least the 2nd century, the relics were defined through the recognition by some audience of the presence of power that leads to a certain desirability. Without some form of recognition, a relic is merely bone, dust, or scraps of cloth, end quote. Han's appraisal of the holy and its relation to an audience is fairly normative in Western academic discourse on the agency of things. However, as Susanna Kuchler and I have argued at length in our book that's coming out this month, this kind of discourse misses the point and ignores the sequential capacity of the image to do much what Yanaras was outlining in terms of it acting as a mental model through which the person may enter into a relationship with the prototype. A limited interpretation of the capacity of the image does not account for the social agency exerted by the saints and their icons in situations such as that described by Charles Stewart, wherein saints pictured in buried icons appear to villagers asking them to dig. Cases where the saints provide the human an image through which to enter into an empirical relationship of love. This invitation is not initiated by the audience, but by what Yanaras calls the personal power or the personal energy of the divine. Orthodox Christianity is a tactile and sensual religion. As Jill Dubish says, within of the priest's hand are highly normative aspects of public devotion. In March of this year, the right arm of St. George the Victory Bearer made a tour of Great Britain. On his tour, he came to visit the Greek parish a short walk from my own home here in Greater London. I picked my children up early from school and walked down to the parish. We entered the small building and I ushered the children into the back pew to talk them through what they saw. It was not the first time they had seen a relic, but it was likely the first time that they will remember. When they joined the short queue and proceeded to genuflect, rise up, kiss the arm and the finger and the little holes that you can see on the image. And then we crossed ourselves again and retreated to our pew to stand quietly. Before leaving, we did this a second time. During our time in the temple, a constant trickle entered, kissed the arm of St. George in veneration, stood in prayer, and a few chatted with the 4 hieromonks who were accompanying St. George on his trip from the Athonite monastery of Xenophontos. I do not know if anyone in the room that day ascended via the image through the cognitive passage into passionate love and communion with St. George and God. But all this symbolic affirmations and negations were present and inviting. The tears, the unstable old knees, these certainly spoke of some suffering. As some of you may know, the 4 monks returned to Mount Athos, not only with St. George, but also with COVID-19. As the Orthodox world responded to the pandemic, and as dioceses and parishes responded to governmental injunctions, a variety of responses ensued. Too many, in fact, to go in here, but 2 are worth unpacking. The first relates to the Eucharist. While some voices in Orthodoxy accepted that no one can come ill at all from anything in the church, if they enter in faith, these voices were largely quieted as the months dragged on. A more sustainable argument is one where no one can come ill from the Eucharist, but people can contract the virus from crowded temples, from kissing surfaces which the virus might rest upon, and probably from sharing the zapivka, the washing down cup used in the Slavonic rite. Even without this argument, however, some have moved to introduce temporary measures for the comfort of the people or to satisfy the state injunctions, such as sterilizing the shared spoon upon the Eucharist between serving each person. The second relates to encourage the faithful to refrain from kissing and touching icons, the hands of the priest, and other shared surfaces. The tactile encounter with the surface of the icon can, the faithful are reminded, be done with the eyes. The contagious capacity of the saint's power, like love, invites physical contact, but can be transmitted even at social distance. Symbolon means to draw together, to conjoin. It is the opposite of what might push apart, the diabolic. Symbols do not represent, they conjoin the signified to the interpretant. It is important to note, however, that the Eucharist is not, strictly speaking, a symbol. It is substantially what it is, that is Christ. It is the liturgy, the whole cycle of liturgical life that is symbolic. It is the fasting, the prayer, the participation in the liturgy, the acceptance of the invitation of the image to that cognitive passage to heaven. That is symbolic. The urgency of communion has offered a wide variety of practices as the symbols of the rite are fluxed in order to allow the bodily participation in God. A priest in the US offers drive-through communion in the parking lot for parishioners who have said the Typica and pre-communion prayers at home. Rumors of priests serving or communing people in secret circulates. With the ubiquity of online live streaming of services, conveniently timed technical difficulties and choice framings of the camera are used to occlude practices that may be on the threshold of suitability in the eyes of who? The government? Charles Stewart argues that in the theophanic miracles in the Greek context, what matters is not that one icon of the Annunciation is a finer work of art than the other, but that this one is ours, end quote. This sense of ours is the same that I observe among Orthodox Britons in speaking of the holiness of the saints of Barking as the holiness of our region. If, as I've argued elsewhere, aesthetics is the ethics of the local church, then this hour becomes vital in considering how contagious holiness and the blessing that comes from it circulate. Contagion relies on proximity. It relies on the proximity of participation. Like with contagious magic, evlogia, or blessing, passes through contact as one icon is placed on its miracle-working prototype. As the virus is also contagious through proximity, the new practices enter into the liturgy. The priest uses hand sanitizer as he stands in the holy doors, or the bishop dons a mask embroidered with the Orthodox tri-bar cross. One must ask if these will not be like the use of incense, which historically gained prevalence in part because of its use as preventative medicine during the plague. Will these likewise catch the blessed capacity of symbols to invite the apophatic disclosure and concealment of Orthodox passion? Or will they be wiped away as senseless, temporary accommodations to the government and public health policy? If, as Yanaras says, the apophatic process of empirical relation is independent of any kind of a priori necessity, then it follows that it can only function properly without governmental imposition, as governance itself is an a priori injunction. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. It was a absolutely fascinating talk, and I think, I mean, there are clearly many overlaps with the themes that Candace foregrounded. I was also thinking, how that you really managed to explain and vividly explicate how symbols operate in terms of proximity, contact, space, and the connection that they might instantiate. But also, one thing that I really appreciated is this emphasis on sensuality, which seems to reveal that love itself, love of God, but also love coming from God, is inherently contagious.
Yeah.
Our next speaker is Vlad Nomescu. Vlad, I'll leave you a minute to set up your presentation.
Okay, hello everyone. It's nice to see you, and I hope this will work. One thing I have to disclose now is that we didn't speak to each other. So there is a certain continuity, but this continuity is not strategically planned in advance. I was really happy with the first two presentations, and especially Timothy's, I think, because it saves me a lot of time in trying to argue along similar lines. So what I want to talk about now today is mysteries. And this is just a tiny bit of something that I've been doing for some time in thinking about mysteries, holy mysteries, but mysteries more broadly and what they can offer us. We are all from, in a sense, and this would be my contribution to the panel, and thinking about orthodoxy, materiality, and the senses. So we are all familiar, and we've heard from Timothy a passionate argument for how orthodoxy's entanglement with materiality and the senses, and through its fully, the only thing I can add, synesthetic dimension, the senses as a privilege way to God, to a communion with God, where aesthetics, ethics, and politics become intertwined, that he showed. So Sonia has also, Luhrmann, in her introduction to this edited volume, Praying with the Senses, she also observed that it seems especially fitting to approach orthodoxy, Orthodox Christianity this way, since rather than belonging to an overarching structure, Orthodox Christians share a commitment to, and I quote her, recognizable choreographies of gestures, sounds, images, and corresponding attitudes that can produce quite strong distinctions from non-Orthodox outsides. So even before getting to this ideal communion, one feels he or she belongs to this kind of imagined orthodoxy only by embodying this and relating to this style or aesthetic formation, in Birgit Meyer's term. This which transcends local churches and traditions. also to and becomes a political resource at some points. I've just written about the theopolitics of communion and territory, thinking about how communion plays a role actually in schisms and reunifications and autocephaly. So the mysteries of faith, as the church sacraments are called in the Orthodox Church, are a key to the Orthodox aesthetics, to the semiotic ideology mediating God's presence in the world and defining the scope and modalities through which it can be apprehended. And I think Timothy made a really nice argument here. It is appropriate to call them mysteries, theologian Callistus Ware says, because they are revealed to our understanding, yet never totally and exhaustively revealed. Both visible and invisible, a combination of an outward visible sign with an inward spiritual grace. So mysteries are accessible in practice, yet inaccessible to reason, beyond the limits of human understanding, but maintaining the possibility of a full revelation. And that's part of what I will argue here, something I call the promise of knowability. In this sense, mysteries are like angels, messengers of the divine, pointing to the original revelation that is yet to be fully revealed. This analogy with the angels was inspired by an old article by Bruno Latour, Quand les anges deviennent de bien mauvais messagers, when angels become bad messengers, which compares regimes of mediation in science and religion. Latour distinguishes with science between chains of references that transmit information through a series of translations, and which represents basically a scientific regime of mediation, to what he calls processions of mediations, a series of repetitions supposed to faithfully maintain the original revelation in religion. So these processions of angels that you see here. Angels, unlike instruments, scientific instruments, are bad messengers, Latour claims, because they are incapable of retracing the chain of references that leads back to the original message. In his words, and I put his words down here because I don't think the Google Translate or these captions can get the whole sense of it. I'll let you read it for a second. So the role of angels is not to transmit a message, but to bring the interlocutor here and now, to make present. Let's call them meta-messengers because they only signal other messengers, but they do not really transmit a message. They are just there, present, and point to further layers of mediation that are supposed to lead back to an original revelation, yet cannot guarantee that one finds anything at the end. So they announce, but do not become warrants of what will be at the end. Angels have somehow passed into oblivion by now. They're withering away, reflecting the disenchantment of the world. But some messengers, like the Holy Mysteries, are still around and continue to signal a divine presence for Orthodox Christians today. So I'll just play for a moment, just to show you the... The Holy Mysteries developed historically as rites of the church, manifested in and through the ritual practice, being proclaimed in the ritual and experienced by celebrants and participants alike. The liturgical sequence you observe reflects their nature. The curtain hides the moment when the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ, the true mystery of faith, which reveals God's true and genuine presence. The mystery is then revealed in the great entry through a well-scripted choreography of concealment and exposure that marks the position of the believer between the human world and God. And you've heard from Timothy this choreography played out also. The whole aesthetics and sensory experience in this sense points to the mysteries and at the same time tries to keep them a mystery. It's a spectacle of mysteries, like a procession of mediation, which reveals just enough to indicate that more remains to be discovered. The promise of a revelation, of knowing, of a knowability. So beyond the ritual context, however, and we can talk more about the ritual and the role of mysteries in ritual, but I'm interested to move beyond the ritual context. Mysteries play out also in the kind of deference and deferral and epistemology and the practice of deference and deferral that characterizes Orthodoxy, and colleagues that wrote about this. In an example that Sonia gives in this introduction to Praying with the Senses, she says, I met this priest, also doctor, who represented the Association of Orthodox Physicians, and asked him what happens to the soul of unbaptized babies who die. And he says, I have written a thesis about them. This father of the church says this, and this father of the church says that, but in the end it is a mystery. So mystery is also used in this sense as a way to defer the response or the actual truth to the answer to such a question. But first time I thought about mysteries was with Alicia, a girl I've been following quite a lot for a few months during her Sunday school competitions, whose speech was about holy mysteries. So listening to Alicia's speech in the Sunday school, her Sunday school belonging to the Jacobite Orthodox Church in Kerala, I started to think of how mysteries act and where is that power comes from beyond the ritual context. In their church, thanks to Protestant missionaries, the mysteries, rites, the rituals that you've seen have also been turned into textbook knowledge with the establishment of missionary schools in the 19th century. This process of religious modernization that also Candace talked about earlier in Egypt, same missionaries, involved the textualization of ritual, which turned the liturgical experience of mysteries into educational material. It was a major epistemic shift from indigenous pedagogies based on learning by doing, where form and content were indistinguishable and knowledge was essentially liturgical. This rationalization of church mystery was supposed to make explicit the implicit knowledge, the embodied knowledge acquired through ritual participation, and replace the blind ritualism of indigenous Christians. So mysteries are now discussed in Sunday schools, and children are encouraged to understand and acquire knowledge about the rituals and their meaning. They learn about and proclaim the mysteries in their elocution speeches, like Alicia's, and I quote, saying passionately, Jesus Christ was a complete man and at the same time a complete God. The holy bread which we consume in the Holy Kurbana is bread made of wheat flour and at the same time becomes the living body or flesh of Jesus Christ. This is a mystery. This was a speech on Jesus as the bread of life, right? An biblical analogy to the Eucharistic mystery too. This mystery, though known as, that we've also seen as mystery of transubstantiation, makes sense and makes a reference to another mystery, more important one, which is the mystery of incarnation and Christ's dual nature, human and divine. So here the referential chain from mystery to mystery resembles Latour's procession of angels, moving from messenger to messenger in search for the original revelation message. It's also like a nested Chinese boxes, to come closer to anthropology, an analogy that Barth used to describe the 7 levels of initiation in Bakhtaman's secret tradition. Their epistemology of secrecy shapes the social organization, distribution of knowledge and learning through this process of gradual revelation, moving from one stage to the other. But at the end, there is nothing, as he says, since all-knowing God, in terms of which abstract absolute truth, there is no all-knowing God in terms of which abstract absolute truth can be conceptualized. So the ultimate custodians are the ancestors. However, holy mysteries, the holy mysteries of Orthodoxy proclaim ultimate truth, and their content preoccupied Christians for centuries. The early church fathers put a high emphasis on the incomprehensibility of God, a central concept in Orthodox patristics. But instead of leaving it there, like an opacity claim that shapes people's knowledge and practice, like other opacity ideologies anthropologists describe, they went on to explain, talking about the 3 persons in the Trinity, one in their being but distinct in their personhood, or the hypostatic union, Jesus with one person with 2 natures, human and divine. These statements, which are grounded in a long history of Christian apologetics and schism, generated, in fact, the mysteries of faith as we know them now. The mysteries, in this sense, pushing the limits of human understanding beyond reason or intuition, and hence creating communion or the Eucharistic communion as an embodied experience of the mysteries, as the possibility to enter in communion, to get this knowledge through bodily experience, are intrinsically opaque. Something similar to what Rappaport called in his Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity, ultimate sacred postulates that resist empirical falsification and logical necessity. Now, Christianity has placed the word, with a big W, at the center of faith, making language the primary instrument by which something that is ineffable gets expressed. Orthodox Christians, however, use this affordance of the language in different ways than the more Protestants we are more used to, or commonly we expect, whether refusing speech because God is beyond language, silence is the message, a monk said once to me, an Indian monk, or cultivating sacred languages that are rarely understood by people, like Syriac or Church Slavonic, through apophatic, as you heard Timothy, or cataphatic theology. The language of mysteries, however, does not deny, obscure, or limit speech. It approaches God by endlessly attempting to employ words in relation to him and experience its inevitable failure. Distorting, observing the grammar of language and depriving it of all its representative function, it points to something that is beyond representation. Language, though we can call it meaningless, remains in this way a privileged medium for the divine, making present something that is otherwise unavailable to our senses, or even when it is unavailable to us. So to finish, like angels, mysteries sanctify through their simple presence, but they also stimulate at the same time the pursuit of the original message. They are accessible in practice, yet inaccessible to reason, beyond understanding, but maintaining the possibility of a full revelation. They remind Orthodox Christians about the impartiality or imperfection of human being, something which also fits into a model, an ethical model that I wrote about of deification, of theosis. And while encouraging them to pursue this perfection further, this encounter with God further, thus sustaining the creative uncertainty of living a tradition made up of many voices and models of Christian formation. Last but not least, it resists rationalization, meaning using a language that subverts the logic of language. They remain thus independent of exegetical mysteries, of exegetical efforts, change or variation in practice and belief, but continue to incite the quest for meaning. This makes them good messengers, since once established or postulated, they maintain the orientation towards the original message, resisting all interference. Historically, at least, it proved to be so. By saying that God is beyond human understanding, yet made accessible in the sacraments, in the mysteries, they postulate something beyond reach, but also maintain the promise of knowing, of knowability indefinitely, a moment of deferral of a never attainable beyond. Thank you.